This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Hey, we'd love to have a rating or review on iTunes. If you'd like to head over there and just leave whatever rating and review you'd like to, it would really help us keep the podcast going. Thanks so much.
Hello, and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Catherine, Robert, and I are talking about the nitty-gritty of sentence-level writing, actual grammar. You know, that stuff that we really need to have a handle on to be competent writers before we even talk about prose or voice or narrative craft. So why is this topic important to us? We're creative. We have creative licenses, artistic endeavors. Can't we do away with this level of nitpicky writing?
I reckon at a very straightforward level, it'll save you money because otherwise you're going to have to pay someone else to tidy it up.
Mm-hmm.
And it does help, I think, if when you get more practiced at it, the first drafts come out cleaner. So you're going to save yourself time and agony there, reading over things and wondering why it doesn't sound right. Once you understand how the grammar can help strengthen every single sentence, every single paragraph, then it starts to come more naturally, I think, and your flow will be different. And I think it gives you choice of style as well. So if you want to write something that's jarring and punchy compared to something that's more soaring and smooth, then you can choose to use grammar to help assist that. It won't necessarily provide it on its own, but it's one of the tools we have in our boxes. So There's my top of the head thoughts.
Yeah, those are brilliant. And I wasn't ready to take notes. I didn't have my notebook open, Robert. I'm like, dang it. Okay, so the first one, money, I hadn't even thought of that because I always think of art first, but you are so right. And that's such a useful point for people to keep in mind, is that if you are willy-nilly with your basic grammar and punctuation and sentence structure, it will cost you in the end. It'll cost you time as you go about fixing things, and it'll cost you money when you have to hire someone to spot all the mistakes you missed. So I love that one. And then you said we become better writers stylistically when we make our grammar and punctuation work for us. That was a paraphrase, but
yeah. A bit before that, I was saying that I think you'll find your first drafts will come out more smoothly. All of us, and by that I don't mean to be condescending to anybody however your first draft comes out is how it comes out. It's fine. But I certainly noticed, particularly after having practiced for years on book descriptions, which really have to be tight grammar-wise. We do bend some grammar rules, but in general, you have to be pretty tight. I do notice how, and I've gone back to a first draft recently because I'm working on the second book and reworking some of it, which is really exciting. But I'm finding in there that, oh my goodness, how many run-on sentences. I mean, everybody has them, right? But I know that now I wouldn't do that. My practice is different. So I think the delivery of first drafts will be different unconsciously because it's you can't unlearn a skill. Like riding a bike, once you know your grammar inside out, it just comes out that way. And it can turn it. Look, and we've seen them all online. People who jump in and put the little, pointy carrot thing up to the comment above and double check someone's grammar. So you can't unsee it once you know it too. So warning. And then the third thing was about the choice of style, where it gives you those tools to use. I think if you want to, go something that's a little bit more punchy, choppy, short, snappy, then you understand how you can use grammar some grammar rules to help you there, as opposed to if you want something to feel more soaring and smooth. So, yeah, that was my little recap.
Right. Yeah, great. Thank you. And the point you were making about learning the rules and not being able to unsee them gives us a wonderful takeaway from this show. It's a worthwhile investment to study this stuff now, right? If you put it off because it's tedious, it's dull, who wants to spend a Saturday, working on grammar? If you never learn it, then you're going to keep making those same mistakes and you're going to have to continually correct them. And it does become a downstream problem. But if you fix it now, if you put the time in, then it is going to change the way you do your first drafts. It'll change the way the sentences form in your mind before they even get to the page. Eventually, it'll take some time. But I think that's a great thing to remember when we set out to study any of these craft concerns.
Yeah, and it's important to note that, like, we talk about, the rules of grammar and know this grammar, and the why is because it's clarity, right? It's allowing people to interpret your work the way that you intended for it to be interpreted, because we've all seen, like, you put the comma in the wrong spot and it changes the meaning of the sentence. Now, you may just say, but that's where I paused and that's where I felt that the comma should go. But your reader, whether or not they know the grammar rules, they may not say, oh, that comma was in the wrong spot, but they may interpret it differently than you intended because of the comma, right? So then we have that grammar rule impinging on your clarity of text, which, is not what you want to have happen. That's a silly mistake to have ruin a reader's experience, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you said it. Yes, I find misplaced commas continually in manuscripts, and I don't copy edit because my writers are going to rewrite that manuscript after I get my hands on it as a developmental editor. But I will, when I see a repeated error, I make a notation to try to help the writer learn the rule. But what I know is happening as a writer and as a reader of these manuscripts, I know that the writer is hearing the passage in their head and punctuating it for the way they hear it. So they're putting in spaces for breath or spaces for thought or spaces for whatever. But that isn't what the sentence says because of the rules of grammar, because of the conventions of language. And you can't expect a reader to hear what's in your head. That doesn't happen, right? So you cannot punctuate for delivery. You have to punctuate for clarity, for meaning. We're nodding. Catherine and I are nodding.
Well, and that goes for every kind of area of grammar, not just punctuation, right? Like using your pronouns, using your, I'm trying to think of all the different, things that now are escaping my brain. But like all of these components, right? If they're not used in the proper order and in the proper way, you're losing the reader on something that is very technical rather than artistic. And if you want your art to speak and be conveyed properly, you need to have the technical down.
Yes. Yeah. You can't expect art to carry from you to the page to the reader's experience of your story if you're making technical mistakes, because there are enough readers who know and they'll identify the mistakes and you lose their trust. They'll never read you again. And then there are readers who might not know, but it'll feel off. They'll sense it. It just isn't, instead of just smoothly reading, there'll be some kind of hiccup in their reading process and in their mental absorption of it. And then, as you were saying, art just goes out the window because now we're looking at flawed text.
Right.
And actually, I think that since the sort of independent publishing revolution, there's been a lot more reviews on Amazon specifically anyway, and I'm sure they exist elsewhere, where the grammar level will be pointed out to a degree where they'll actually say, oh, I didn't find any typos or grammatical errors. But okay, well, we never used to say that about books. Why are we saying that now? And it's probably because there's a few more slipping through the cracks. That, if there's one thing I suppose a traditional publishing house had in its power, it was the sort of army of copy editing and proofreading that, and even then, we still find typos, obviously. But
but it's kind of a fun game at that point. You're like, oh, look what I found.
Yeah, that's right. See, even Stephen King can't spell.
Right.
But also, I think, sometimes in knowing the differences, it can be helpful as well. For example, if I said, Catherine and me went to the shops, then, we know that's grammatically incorrect. But if it's in a character's dialogue, then maybe I've chosen that specifically to represent, that particular character's demographics or how they speak. And I've knowingly used grammar to bring that to life, for example.
Right. But if you're doing that, then it has to be apparent to the reader that it's intentional. So if it occurs once and not multiple times, then that transparency won't be there and the reader will just assume that you made a mistake. So you can either have another character call your character out, or you can have enough quirks in the dialogue that we see this is the character, this is a trait. And then you have to find that balance point between enough and too much. It can become very annoying. If you ever look at an old book, like before the 20th century, or maybe even early 20th century, when somebody tries to write dialect, it is almost unreadable. It is just atrocious. It's so difficult. So, just make it apparent.
If you don't know the dialect too, like if they're referencing maybe something that you've never heard that accent, and they're trying to, you just like can't hear it in your head. It's like, okay, now I just don't know what they're saying.
I've had that with some American books, where they were actually. I've got two examples from the Spencer books. Actually, one is occasionally he will correct the character. Spencer will correct one of the others and say whom. It just says the one thing, and the other character kind of gets stymied. What? He says it's whom, but it doesn't matter, and then he just moves on. And it's part of his whole character makeup because he is extremely well read. It's not just an author wearing something on their sleeve. It's showing an aspect of this particular man's character. He's not just, a kind of buff, beefy PI. He's got an intellectual side and a thinking side and a philosophical side. So it occasionally slips out in things like grammar correction. But the other, I was rereading one the other day, and they were, a waiter came up to their table where they were having breakfast at a hotel and spoke in a funny way. And then so they were mentioning, oh, you're from Boston. And it was spelled, some things spelled out there phonetically. And I have no idea how that's supposed to sound. Like, I don't know what a Boston accent is. I imagine it's a little posher or something, but it wasn't possible to get it. So, it can definitely trip you up.
Yeah, which brings up a really good point about the assumptions we make about our readers. If you try to write a dialect into your story and you change spelling and punctuation and allied words in such a way that it becomes incomprehensible to anybody who doesn't know that particular dialect, then, as with incorrect punctuation, you lose your readers. So do you really want to write a book where somebody has to go Google audio of Boston accents? Right. Or do you want it to be understandable within the context of the story?
Which is kind of I suppose that's hanging on the fringes of grammar, isn't it?
We're kind of slipping into dialogues. We can come back around.
Come back to you, because you're probably more conscious of this. And, I have to go look up things when I'm thinking, hey, should I be using a comma before this, or should I, are these dependent clauses or independent? I don't know. And I think a lot of people are like this, where many authors are readers first. So we probably learned our grammar through osmosis, whereas you've gone and studied it to some degree. What are some of the common things that you do see?
In other people's work, the misplaced comma, for sure, punctuating for the way they hear instead of the meaning of the actual sentence. Fragments. So you mean fragments are just a terrible thing.
So what is a fragment?
Fragmented sentences where people just write a clause and put a period at the end of it. And, you see this in writing, creative nonfiction and creative fiction and narrative writing, often for effect, right? So it is something that we're used to seeing, and it can be done well and effectively, but it's done well when it follows enough material that we know the context. We understand why we're getting those fragments. They might form a list that's being structured as fragments instead of with commas or semicolons and commas and then a period. It might be to create the rhythm of sort of quick, choppy activity. But quite a number of writers will use them in place of regular sentences and overdo it. They use them when they aren't being effective, and they use too much of them. They're relying on them. It's sort of like when you're thinking in your mind, you might eliminate subjects and just give yourself a verb and an object a lot because you're just moving through your to-do list, or you're just kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but that doesn't work in literature. It strips away the narrative, and with it, it often strips away the meaning. And when it's overdone, it becomes repetitive and tedious. Anything done to excess can pull the reader out of the story. So Stop writing fragments.
So how would you practice stop writing fragments then? What have you got to look for? I think I get a sense of what you're talking about, because to me, when I read a fragment, I think what's happening in my head is I'm expecting something else, and the something else doesn't appear. So that's when I think, this is an incomplete sentence.
Yes.
So how do I?
Yeah.
Are there two steps? Is it first recognizing and then editing?
Right. So the first is recognizing. If you're looking at a paragraph, a block of text, and you see a bunch of 3 to 5 word sentences, and if you read them out loud, you're getting this rhythm of sort of da 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 da, right? There's no variation in it. If you don't see any commas in those sentences, then it's like, it's just a clause. If some of them are lacking verbs and or subjects, then they definitely aren't complete sentences. And so then look at each one on its own. What does this say? What is the meaning I'm trying to convey? Okay, what is missing? If I don't read it with the surrounding sentences, and I try to get myself out of the movie playing in my head and just look at the sentence. Okay, so I need to add a subject here. I need some kind of a verb, and I want to flesh this out. I want to make it play in the reader's mind. And then some of those choppy little bits might combine together well to create a whole sentence. So that's how I would work with it in revision.
Okay. Are we able to come up with an example off the top of our heads of a fragment without necessarily putting anybody on the spot? What would one sound like? Because I think one of these things.
Do that, Robert.
No, but I'm thinking that. I'm happy to try, but it's the same with, you can't unsee grammar once you know it. So you'll see a sentence and you'll know it doesn't work, or you'll see something grammatically that's incorrect. Albeit there are some differences between, say, UK, Australian, and American, but they generally follow the same sort of rules.
I've got 3 exciting brand new workshops coming to you this fall. They are all single topic, single session workshops, so not a big commitment time-wise or money-wise. We are going to dive in to writing backstory into your now story. And a couple weeks later, I'm bringing you weaving together character, plot, and theme. Then in October, making your readers fear and fear for your characters. Get all the details and sign up at storyworksfiction.com. And don't forget to join my email list or follow me on Instagram or Facebook to keep up to date on all the great stuff I've got coming out this fall.
I find it hard.
Either a subject or a verb, right? So
let me look in my handy-dandy style manual.
It's hard to come up with an example because we now naturally tend to form them the right way. Do you see what I mean? So it's kind of hard to say. It's like saying drive down the street badly. I can't do that anymore.
Well, you could say like the grass, the dry grass, the sun-baked grass. Oh, there's only one potential real sentence in there, right? Because the grass period is just a subject. Yes. Technically sun-baked is an adjective at this point because we're describing. So it's not, the grass is still not being acted upon.
No.
So the sun baking the grass. There you go. Complete sentence.
Complete sentence. Yeah. So that's similar to what I was thinking of. I had, the black table. Well, the black table, exactly. What, where, how, and Whereas
right. And we were saying, like, you can use it for effect, right? So you could say, I looked out the window, the grass, the sun-baked grass. It was hot.
Right.
Something like that. But it wouldn't be something I would want to repeat over and over and over again. It would be used specifically to give me a moment, right?
Right. And my style manual is not actually helping me because the examples it gives as fragments are more complete than what I'm seeing in manuscripts. This is the 5th edition, and I think it's up to the 10th edition. This is Rules for Writers by Diana Hacker, by the way, for people not on video. And I wonder if they've changed those examples to keep up with the times.
Modern.
With the way, I mean, this isn't that old of a book, but languages evolve, and with technology, language is evolving faster than ever before.
Okay, so with fragments, it's a case of trying to understand what they are first, and then seeing how you rearrange what you've got, or looking for patterns of, say, choppy things, and it helps to read them out. Then with misplaced commas, that would be similar. It would help to read them out because that might, or give them to someone else to read out. If you're not sure where something, I mean, obviously not, an entire book, but if you've got some sentence constructions you're trying to practice and get better at, you give it to someone else, say, read this out loud and see how they do that.
Right. Right. But you have to be careful with an oral translation because people might read a period as though it's a comma, and then you aren't going to hear the fragments, so you have to watch for those sentence breaks and, the lack of a subject, the lack of a verb, opening a sentence with a conjunction, or, a gerund, a verb with an ing instead of linking those clauses with a comma. So hearing it might not help because you aren't really going to hear the difference between a comma and a period. And not everybody reads punctuation the way it's meant to be read. Actually, I had an experience of this recently with a friend who read something out loud, and I was reading the text along, And I was like, oh my God, that's killing me, because the rhythm of the sentences as they were being read aloud did not match the punctuation and sentence breaks on the page.
Yes, true.
It was painful.
True. Depends on the skill of the orator, yes.
Yeah. Well, on the skill of the reader,
Right.
the reader has to understand how to read the punctuation. I imagine it's sort of like reading musical notes. You have to know how long this rest is versus that rest, and this note versus that note, in order for it to actually translate.
Yep. All right. So here's the real nitty gritty. How do I practice this? So I know, let's say, okay, raising my hand here. I know I am bad at run-on sentences, or I'm really bad at starting with conjunctions, because those tend to make me happy. So how do I say, okay, now how do I fix it? What do I look for? How do I practice this? How do I become better at grammar?
Right. So I have something I call red flag words, because when I work with a manuscript, I see the mistakes writers make habitually. If they're making it in the first 5 pages, they're probably making it on page 300 as well. And so I will tell writers, if you see this word, if you write this word, you need to stop and look at that passage of text. So for Catherine, if you like to start with conjunctions, you might say, oh, I'm reading my manuscript to revise, and here's a period. And then the next word is and, or but, or because. And then you have to do an assessment.
Yes.
Is that there for effect because I want to use it for emphasis in this particular moment? Or is that just me exercising a bad habit?
Right.
And there's some universal red flag words, things everybody should be aware of. And then there are the ones that are particular to the writer, because we all have pets. We all have favorite little things we use. I like to write as though,
yes,
the wind played in her hair as though a lover whispered her name, right? I mean, that's corny and just came off the top of my head, not something I wrote, but you see how as though gets used. So for me, I get to use it because I like it, but I don't get to overuse it. So if I see it twice in a chapter, or if I'm like, oh God, okay, I'm getting sick of those 2 words, I know I need to restrain myself there.
It's kind of like when you're spelling a word and you've spelled it so many times, you're like, is that really how it's spelled? Like, you are spelling it correctly, but now your brain is catching it because you're like, wait, is that actually, that means you've used it too much. Like, oh, I see it again. I see it again. I see it again. I see it again. Once you're aware of that, you will catch it down the page. Like, you don't even have to read your manuscript completely. You can just be like, and, oh, look, and again. Oh, look, there's and again. Look, there's period and again.
Right. Well, and the beauty of Word and Scrivener is you can put into the search period, space, capital A, and it will find all of those for you. So you don't have to click through every time the word and appears in your manuscript, or every single period. You can just hit the 200 uses that you put into that novel and pare it back to 10.
So what are some useful tools to learn grammar? Does everyone have their favorites for learning? Yeah,
the handy dandy style manual.
Rules for Writers by Diana Hacker.
Yes, Rules for Writers by Diana Hacker. This is the one I had to buy for my Master of Liberal Studies program. And it is my grammar Bible. I have never had need for another one. It's easy to use. It makes sense. It's got a great index, and there's nothing, there is like a research guide because it is an academic text, but it's small. So if you're looking at style manuals, physically pick one up. I've got a DK handbook that I got when I was getting my MFA, and that was a teaching tool meant for students in freshman comp specifically. And that was why I had to buy it, so I could teach freshman comp. But too much of it is geared toward writing a research paper and not enough for grammar. Rules for Writers is almost 600 pages, and love this book. So, there is some stuff on process and design and clarity and argument and research, but you just won't go wrong with this manual. So, yes. And of course, you can Google questions. The problem I have with using the internet to answer grammar and structure questions is you end up with like hundreds of results. And if you don't know what you're looking for, if you aren't looking for like confirmation of how you really kind of know it should be, you might be misled. There are people who get it right and people who have the right answer, but they don't explain it well, and people who aren't really right, who are, going to misguide you. So just get a manual.
Yes, I've learned to
size grammar. Yeah. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah. So I'm probably going to say the same thing as you, but bite size for sure. On the Google searches, you tend to, after a while, find who your trusted sources are. So Grammarist, Grammarly, or Grammar Girl, and Catherine, I think you're probably just about to mention.
Yeah, Grammar Girl. She's got really good little bite-sized chunks. You can go to her podcast and what are they, like 3 to 5 minutes, something like that, where she'll just explain one little tiny bit of grammar. And so it gives you that like little, oh, okay, that's what that is, without having to, dig through 600 pages if that's not your thing. And I do know that she also has so much content out there that you could probably search her website or whatever and find the podcast episode on your pain point, if that's how you like to do content.
Yeah. It's great to have a go-to trusted resource for sure. So Grammar Girl, definitely a good one. And I like having something physical in my hand. So I'm not spending time on a search engine, or I'm not spending time, what if you don't know what it's called? What if you're like, I need this answer to this problem, but I'm not sure what the name of the problem is, right? So if you go to the, punctuation section and, it has to do with whatever, joining clauses, then you can skim the page as opposed to trying to guess the name of the thing for the search engine.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah,
because somebody like me, I'm really not going to go back and try and learn object, subject, who's acting on what. I just, that was probably some of my most hated stuff at school, the English. I like punctuation, so I don't know where that came from. I've enjoyed learning about that, but there's just no way I could. Sometimes I struggle, like the who and whom example, for example, which is probably falling out of fashion anyway to some degree, but nonetheless, it's good to know. And so I'm not going to go back and practice subjects, objects, verbs, who's acting on what.
Not your thing.
Who does that?
Yeah. So conjunctions and conjugation. Yeah. So, I mean, but I suppose at our respective sort of levels of ages and experience, we've got enough reading under our belt that we probably do know a lot, just out of conscious awareness.
Right.
So I think Catherine's point about, if we do, and I can recognize that this is going wrong in my prose, how do I practice doing it right? And that I think is the sort of the tricky bit.
Right. And that's where the tools become necessary, so none of us, we all don't know what we don't know. Right. But once you start sensing something is going wrong or somebody points it out to you, then you need to find out what the right answer is, so you don't go from one mistake to another mistake. And then that's where you want to use the tools. And then once you learn the correct way. And the reason behind it, of course, I find things don't stick. You could tell me what something should be, but if I don't understand the why or the how, I won't necessarily adopt it. So that's another place where the tools come in handy. I'm not suggesting anybody go start diagramming sentences, but just
unless you really want to.
Right. Sure. If that's your hobby, more power to you. But knowing what you're doing, how and why is
can be helpful.
Huge. Yeah. To actually integrating these things into your writing.
So I think what I would probably do is try and pick one thing that's my biggest fault to start with, and find a way to recognize that quickly and learn the tool to fix it, rather than thinking, oh my goodness, how do I improve my whole grammar? Because that's just not going to happen. And when you were talking about Scrivener searches, for example, I back in the early day when I was probably adverb man, I went through I set up an ly search. And oh dear, that was shocking. Just don't do that. And then you start to realize, well, okay, people speak like that. It's fine to have adverbs and dialogue, but it's where I've used them, poorly in prose to just, get. And we've talked about this before. There is nothing essentially wrong with them. It's like anything, it's the overuse. And it's okay in first draft where things are just, you're throwing them faster than you can, your mind is racing along, you're trying to get things down. You haven't got time to stop and think, surely there's a better verb for this than saying, I don't know, the smoothly running water, there's got to be, but you can't stop. You just got to keep going. And so you come back in revision. So, I think it's worth finding out what your biggest, I like that term weasel words, as you've said, find perhaps if you've got specific words that can trigger the misconstruction of something, then that makes it an easier way to set up the flags, or would you call them red flag words?
Red flag words.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And just pick one thing to start with that maybe you're always getting feedback from beta readers or editors. I cut down your 300 really, really long sentences, or I fixed 20 fragments in this chapter. That kind of thing. Are you getting those sort of patterns of responses?
Right. These mistakes really are habitual in our writing. Part of it is that we've trained ourselves to think it's correct. Because we don't know any better, it hasn't been corrected. It's how we speak. It's how we hear the narrative play out in our mind. Whatever the reason, it just becomes patterned, ingrained writing behavior. And so once you can learn to spot it, you're going to change the way you write. And by breaking that pattern, you're going to free yourself up to explore different style choices, different voices, different rhythms in your prose. And that, really goes to what you were saying at the beginning, Robert, your third point about when we work well with grammar, punctuation, syntax, it frees us up to write better narratives. It actually becomes a supportive tool instead of this thing that we had to endure in fifth grade,
Yeah, and I totally agree. And reduces friction for the reader as well, because you don't necessarily stop and, a lot of readers are not going to stop and think, hang on a minute, the grammar is wrong in that bit. We're just reading too fast, but something just feels hard when you, and I'm thinking, because when you were talking there, I think, I just realized one of my mistakes is in first drafts, I have so many parenthetical sentences where my mind is just thinking about other things. So it goes in as commas, or I just trying to explain too much, or I've got too many ideas in one sentence. And so I've tried to I've tried to use grammar to make that work. So, it's ended up with 4 commas or something. or, I've had my editor come back and say, I think you should put a bracket in here. And, no, I don't use brackets. It's my rule. I'm not going to do it. I know some fiction writers will, but I'm just not going to do that. I don't like it. It's a personal pet peeve. So I'm going to find a different way. And you strengthen it by doing that, because you then say, okay, this is actually, there are independent clauses in here that can be completely separated out. And by doing that, I've all of a sudden changed this, and it's so much stronger, because now I'm not forcing the reader to suddenly split into parallel paths down one sentence. And I've used punctuation to make that happen, but I've fixed it with sentence construction and repunctuating. If that makes sense.
Right. No, it makes perfect sense. And that's such a great illustration of what can go wrong when we're trying to put too much into one container. Every word is a container. Every sentence is a container. Every paragraph is a container. Every break, scene break, or, section break in nonfiction creates a container, and then your chapters and so on. And you need to consciously ask yourself, what am I putting into this container? If something isn't effective, is it because, at the sentence level, I've got too many items going into that container? Or is it because I'm writing fragments and there's not enough in that container to actually give it meaning?
Well put. Okay. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. And, I want to kind of go to the flip side of that coin and remind people that long, well-structured sentences can be beautiful. They can be complex and elegant. So it's not that fragments are bad and lots of commas are bad, and there's this happy medium everybody should write in. Narrative has a flow to it. It has a rhythm, just like our scenes, just like our chapters do. And depending on what's happening, who's speaking, what the mood is, what elements you're trying to convey in that moment is going to help you choose your sentences. Historical fiction should not sound like contemporary fiction, and rural fiction should probably not have the same voice as urban fiction. And so listen to the story that wants to be told and put that into words on the page, punctuated and structured correctly so that the reader hears the same story.
Excellent.
Thank you. Catherine's on mute. We can't hear her laugh. Any other thoughts on grammar and punctuation?
No, I think we should come to a full stop.
Oh. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.